In this module, we are now going to explore in depth the works of Minuchin in a structural model of family therapy. Finally, I will introduce you to the concept of a generic or universal model of family therapy. Let's join the workshop.
Okay, so we're going to now shift to the structural model of marriage and family therapy. Okay? And in the structural model of family therapy, what I like to think about this model is sort of the chiropractor of family therapy. Okay, the chiropractor. Why would this be the chiropractor of family therapy? It's about realignment, right? When we go to our chiropractor, anyone ever go to a chiropractor? Okay, I go in one now and again. And I'll say my last time I went, I think my lower back was out. My chiropractor starts realigning my skull, my face, and I'm going, but it's my back. The structural model of family therapy is really looking at sort of how everything fits together, and how that whole sort of, we go back to von Bertalanffy, and we go back to the notion of family organization. We're looking at sort of all the varied aspects of structure that is in a family. It's looking at things like boundaries, which are what? The rules that govern the flow between subsystems. Okay? It's looking at subsystems. It's looking at coalitions and alliances. It's looking at detouring, the notion of parentified child, and now any of you that want to talk about the difference between parentification and parentified child, we're on at least the one that's easier to talk about and get. It's looking at sort of the restructuring of a family system. We're using structural maps and triangles. Okay, when we think about the notion of subsystems, what do we mean by subsystems? What are the subsystems that a structural model might be paying attention to? Couples, parents, could be sisters, could be brothers, could be kids, could be grandparents, could be extended family. We could, move it out in a more ecosystemic way. Okay? When I say ecosystemic, what comes to mind? Von Bertalanffy. But also think of concentric circles in terms of an ecosystem. Think of the circle of the family initially in the center of it. Then what are the sort of influences or forces that are affecting the family at the next level? School, church, community. You could have extended family maybe inside, sort of an interior circle between school and family. But the point is that this is a model that's really looking at how the whole family organization is put together and is going to make adjustments. Now, one of the things that's really different about this model than the strategic models, and note we've shifted now from those three strategic models to structural family therapy, is that the therapy occurs where? Inside or outside of the therapy session? Inside the therapy session. When you've watched Minuchin actually do therapy, what does it look like? He's very directive. He's actually moving people around in the session. He's telling people to get up. He's telling people to sit over here. Okay? He's using many, many different kinds of techniques in order to sort of restructure, realign the family, just like a chiropractor would realign your vertebra in your back. Okay? So he's looking at things like subsystems and coalitions and alliances. And an alliance has to do with working in a positive way towards the sort of either betterment or towards growth or towards something that's positive in the family. And it's always, alliances occur on the same generational level. Whereas a coalition in the structural model speaks to what? A cross-generational sort of engagement, or that works against somebody or something typically. Okay, coalitions are negative, alliances are positive. Okay, he makes distinctions between diffuse and rigid boundaries. What kind of boundaries are we wanting to see after Minuchin works with a boundary? Clear boundaries. Clear boundaries. A diffused boundary or diffuse boundary is what? Yes, they would look like, in Bob Beaver's terms, a family that we would call centripetal, black hole-ish, where a Rigid boundary family would be much more centrifugal, have more rigid boundaries. Okay, we're looking for clear boundaries. One of the things that you'll note in your packets is that I've given you a few handouts actually for mapping a family system, and the phrase or the term of mapping a family system comes from the structural model in Mnuchin's work. Learn those symbols in and out. I will guarantee you that this test could not ever be given without a structural map to be interpreted by you. Learn those symbols on that handout. Okay? So this is the model that we map the system through. And what we do is we would make a structural map, wouldn't we? And then we would decide, okay, based on what we see and what we've mapped out, how are we going to actually restructure that family? What are we going to change? And Mnuchin would start that change occurring in session. Again, another sort of reminder, very helpful to go up to YouTube and see Mnuchin work. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Mnuchin is he's Argentinian and comes from a very patriarchal society. Very patriarchal. And that said, his therapy oftentimes has a very patriarchal element to it. And so he's very traditional in many regards. This is the family therapy model that the feminist family therapists have the greatest deal of difficulty with because it is so patriarchal and so sort of hierarchical in a patriarchal sense. We have concepts such as detouring. What's a detour? What's detouring?
When the parents sort of create a problem with the child, they detour what's going on for them to the child.
Okay, so it's when the parents end up detouring the conflict or tension between them towards a child crossing a generation, generating a triangle. Okay, so detouring is the process by which a triangle emerges in the structural model. And the parentified child, what is that? That a child is bumped up to the parental subsystem and has to take on responsibilities based on now being sort of in an adult role in the family. Is it always dysfunctional? No. Okay. It started out being viewed as being always dysfunctional. In today's society, it is not when done appropriately. Can it be dysfunctional? Certainly. Certainly. Okay. So we talked about there being boundary types. And on his mapping of the family system, a rigid boundary, which speaks to sort of a very disengaged relationship, it comes across as a darker solid line. A clear boundary is more sort of dashes, and that's what we're striving for, and that's how we're going to denote clear boundaries as we do a family map. A diffuse boundary is going to be very sort of way too fluid, and it's going to speak to the notion of enmeshment. Okay. Well, the theory of dysfunction in Mnuchin's model is what? That family structures become inflexible, and they don't adequately adjust to the changing landscape or the developmental shifts that occur naturally in families. So what happens is the family sort of emerges to a new stage of development, and its organizational structure, note, not the rules so much, its organizational structure or the subsystems or the boundaries haven't adjusted accordingly. So Mnuchin's approach is to talk about, again, the way the family has sort of put its structural elements in order, which obviously if we take it to a next level, but aren't there rules and everything that sort of that develop the structural levels? Sure there are. But for our purposes, we just stay at the structural level. Okay? And that life cycle changes really challenge the organizational structure, and the family gets stuck when they don't adjust with those lifestyle changes. Okay? Theory of change, reorganize the family structure. You want to establish a strong parental subsystem. You want to have clear but flexible boundaries between subsystems. Clear but flexible. They need to be very clear, but there needs to be ways in which a family is able to adjust the sort of boundary according to its needs and its appropriate developmental stage. You want to sort of get the family to be able to sort of create change and to address change and to bring about the possibility of change inside the session. And you're going to help the families find resources and strengths. That's the ecosystemic component. You're going to look at sort of the subsequent levels that really are holding this family in its world, the support systems, the extended family, the school systems, the church community, the economic factors, jobs. You're looking at their whole environment and trying to sort of give them access to those supports. Okay, how does the therapy work? The entire family's present for all the interviews as a rule. And you come in, again, Mnuchin comes in from a position of leadership. Okay? He maps the underlying structure. Okay, so he creates a family, or maps the system, as he calls it. You want to map the system. Okay, and then you start making interventions in session to transform that structure. Okay? Oftentimes you might sort of, in the process of mapping, you would use enactments, and you'd actually try to see where the dysfunction's occurring, and then you would start making changes accordingly. There's a tape I once saw called, I think he called it Taming Little Monsters. Anybody ever see that one? Where there's this little girl who's in the middle of the session, she decides, she jumps up and starts playing Duck, Duck, Goose with Mnuchin and the parents and everybody else. And so in the middle of the session, she's running around going, Duck, 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 Goose, and wants to be chased around the room. And so Mnuchin says to mother, or to the father first, can you do something about this? And so the father gets up and he really gets really angry at the little girl, and she just throws a tantrum. And so what ends up happening is Mnuchin is sort of working with the family structure and addressing the idea that the monster, what they're coming in with saying this little girl's a monster, but it's really the fearfulness that everyone has of the dad that really is the issue. But the tape sort of winds and winds to the point where you can see mom addressing dad's fearfulness. And Mnuchin says to the dad, how often does he beat you? I'm sorry, to the wife, how often does he beat you? And no, she doesn't beat me. But then why are you so afraid of him? And then how that fear translates down at the different levels. It's again, Mnuchin's very directive, and he's very authoritative in his work. It's called Taming Little Monsters. You've seen it? Yeah. It's definitely a good one. Okay, so the parentified child is again something that we are okay about with this model. Difference between enmeshment and fusion. Say it again. That's all it is. Bowen and Mnuchin. Okay, same concept, different words. Okay, enmeshment is, when we hear the word enmeshment, we think of structural family therapy and Mnuchin. When we hear the word fusion, we think only of Bowen. Okay, it's one of the jargon tricks to help you orient yourself to which model a question might be talking about. Okay, let's see. What's mimesis? It's a mirroring, adopting of both language and mannerisms in order to, it's a joining technique, but you're sort of mirroring mimesis. Okay? It's an important concept in all this. The stance of the therapist is also very involved and in a position of a leader. This is a model that has, Mnuchin for a while did some work with anorexia. And his famous lunch meetings occurred. Did anyone ever hear about Mnuchin's lunch meetings and how they worked? Well, how do you imagine, based on Mnuchin, how he would work with anorexics or anorexia? He'd bring them in for lunch. They'd have lunch sessions, and of course, and they don't eat, right? So he tells the parents to make them eat. That's the intervention. Okay, it's not pretty. It lasts a long time. Okay, and everyone realizes that anorexia is a life-threatening illness, and that so the medical components outweigh, in a sense, the therapeutic interventions, and that one must have. Typically, it's someone that's younger, oftentimes younger than 18 or 20 years old, and they need to have a pediatrician involved. You have to have an internist or a medical doctor involved in working with them because it truly is life-threatening. One of the things you're always having to do, and oftentimes, is sort of weigh the medical implications in any of our clients that we see, and not just assume just because they're calling asking for treatment that it's there might not be some underlying etiology or pathology that we have to address through the medical system. So just a quick aside for that. I once took a referral from somebody who they wanted couples therapy, and I had just finished a neuropsych class, and as I'm listening to them, it was just didn't sound like real, true relational kinds of issues that were going on. Turned out, I said, before we do anything, will you do me a favor and just go see a neurologist and get a MRI? Turned out I had a brain tumor, and the behavior was really related to sort of an aberration in sort of his actual processes, thought processes based on the brain tumor. Had nothing to do with relationships, but the change was very erratic. And it wasn't something that changed over time. So always rule out any kind of medical issues, and that's certainly true when we talk about sex therapy. You always have to make sure there aren't any kind of physiological causes before you delve into any kind of behavioral changes with sex therapy. Alrighty? All right, so the stance of Minuchin is that he's very powerful. He's going to join and accommodate, and using mimesis in order to do that. Okay, accommodating sort of, again, that process of really sort of getting the family to trust him. He's going to diagnose, and he's going to start looking for what he deems as being the dysfunctional interactions. Now, note, what he deems as being the dysfunctional interactions. He's a very modern theorist, isn't he, or therapist. He has an idea of what is right and what is wrong. He wants a family to look a particular way. So he has a notion of what a healthy family looks like and how it works, and what a dysfunctional family looks like and how it works. And he's actually going to focus all his work on sort of helping the family achieve his model for healthy family functioning or organization. He's going to make boundaries. He's going to unbalance by challenging. He's going to do a lot of enactments in session. He's going to reframe. Remember, can Minuchin use paradoxical techniques? Very definitely. Can he use reframing? Can he use prescribing the symptom? Very definitely. He borrowed that from Haley. Okay, that's what he received from Haley in that cross-fertilization. There'll be direct behavioral tasks, and again, as I said, paradox. We're looking at how the family is organized and the structures of their organization. We're really sort of looking at sort of how resilient they are, and how a family sort of really is affected by one family member's behavior. We're looking at sort of adjusting and balancing at that level. We're looking again at the family's life cycle, very, very important in terms of assessing that. What stage of development are they at? What are the shifts that need to occur in this family organization to help them transition from one stage of development to the next stage of development? Okay? And we're generating data. He would use teams that would be observing the behavior. They would break. They would sort of run back. Again, it would be a sort of a direct observation or interventional team. Then they come back in the room and do some work based on what the team would have to say. A good example of Sal Minuchin and sort of his patriarchal piece and the way he would run his session is that one time I used to supervise his son, Dan Minuchin, and Dan and Sal are very different people. And but Sal wanted Dan to sort of make it in Boston. So he ended up bringing Dan out, and Dan was presenting at a conference with Sal behind him. And Sal didn't like the way Dan was presenting something. And so Sal just kind of got up off the couch behind him and pushed Dan out of the way and started correcting Dan in front of 300 people. That's why the feminists have a hard time with Sal, is that he tends to see things his way. And that's what he's wanting families to do, is to sort of have the parents be in control of having it their way. Now, what's an interesting thing to talk about just for a second is this notion of how families are organized. And I studied, as I mentioned, with David Cantor. And what David Cantor offers, and occasionally there's a question on David on the test, is that he brought in, God bless, he brought in the notion of family types. Now, a family type is, again, a way in which a family is organized, but there isn't a particularly one single way a family should be organized for it to be a healthy family. There are many ways a family can be organized. So what David proposed was that, if you will, that there are three types of families, okay, in terms of the way families can be organized. Now, each of these types of organization is a healthy form, and it also has a dysfunctional. So we have an enabled form and a disabled form. So the first type is sort of more like Minuchin, which is sort of what led me to wanting to talk about this right now, and that's the notion of a closed family system. So a closed family system tends to be a family that is very hierarchical. It's a family that really has a very clear sense of order and structure. Time is very regular. Okay, it's very predictable. It gets back to our Thanksgiving Jell-O salad. Every year we're going to have the same salad and the same place at the table. Dinner will start at the same time. Everyone will be in the same seats. There's a lot of regular predictability in a closed system. Okay, so closed systems tend to be then families and come from ethnic groups that really value that kind of clear hierarchy and structure. Boundaries are very clear and might even be a little bit rigid in terms of a closed system. Okay, so there are very prescribed ways of looking at the world from a closed system. I'm a carpenter because my father was a carpenter and my grandfather was a carpenter and his father was a carpenter. There's just a real sense of continuity from generation to generation to generation. Okay? That's a closed system. Now, we do all of these in the healthy form, and then we'll actually sort of talk about the disabled forms. So the antithesis, if we imagine the closed system to be the thesis, the antithesis of a closed system would be something we call a random system. And a random system is sort of like the, I guess would be epitomized by the old hippie family, do your own thing. That's creativity over, or individual expression over everything else. So that the Thanksgiving, we know what the Thanksgiving would look like in the closed system. In a random system, I'm not sure we're having Thanksgiving this year, or I'm having Thanksgiving. Are you coming?
Laissez-faire.
Laissez-faire. I don't feel like turkey. I'm just going to McDonald's. And if you want to have turkey, that's okay. But the notion being that creativity, the individual is supreme. So here, the collective whole, okay? So the whole of the family is what we're really trying to sort of have being stable and regular and intact. Here, it's about the individual. So the individual's needs, remember the old, the Spock, what Spock used to say in Star Trek in the original, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Okay? So this is the needs of the many outweigh the individual needs, whereas the needs of the individual outweigh the needs of the whole in a random system. Now, a random system can be a very healthy, creative system too. It's times a lot more irregular. You don't have the same predictability, but it's a very spontaneous and creative and high energy. What's the energy like in this system? Doled out, very regular. It's very predictable. Affect's pretty steady. What's it like in the random system? It spikes. Sometimes it can be really low. Sometimes all of a sudden somebody can come home and you come home and your adolescent son has brought home 6 friends and they're playing music in the living room, even though you had planned a dinner party that night. Okay, and that's okay. We'll work around it. Okay, so a random system is going to really support creative expression. We then move to what we call an open system, and most family therapies think that somehow an open system is the way of a healthy family. And what David Cantor did was say, well, there are all these other models that are also healthy too. An open system, if we have the thesis here, the antithesis here, this is the synthesis. Okay? So the synthesis, we're combining or integrating the closed system and the random system, and the maxim here is decisions through consensus, okay? Such that we make decisions based on consensus. How are decisions made in the closed system? From the top down. How are they made in the random system? By the individual. How are they made in the open system? Through consensus. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to decide, and we're going to vote. Where are we going on vacation? Same place we've been every year. Where are we going on vacation? I'm not going on vacation. You go. Okay. Where are we going on vacation? Well, where do you want to go on vacation? Okay. We went to Colorado last year. Let's go to Arizona this year. Well, I don't know. I think okay, but it's just going to be talked about. So this is a much more democratic, sort of egalitarian. Yet you still have a clear hierarchy in place. Parents will say, okay, enough, we've decided, we've talked about it, here are the rules now, here's what we're going to do. In the random model, the parents don't necessarily take that level of hierarchical position. So imagine that each of these models, so this is going to be, we said the whole family, this is going to be the whole family in terms of the focus and the individual. So individual needs and the whole family's integrity is going to be met at the same time. These are all healthy notions. What would it look like if a family was in a disabled form? It wasn't working. What happens in families that have really tight boundaries when trouble hits? The boundaries get tighter, okay? So we would see symptoms like what? A kid running away, okay? So this would be sort of a centrifugal family. It would be a closed system family, to use Bob Beaver's notion again as a family style. It would be a very closed system in its disabled form. When the rule doesn't work, bring in more rules. Don't necessarily change the rules, bring in more rules, bring in more consequences. You just clamp down in this family when things get out of whack. What happens, and this family would have in its disabled form, a harder time making those developmental shifts because they have to change the way things have always been. And if someone is born into this family and they are not able to easily follow suit, like imagine a kid being born into this family that's gay, and it's a very traditional family, very, very difficult for the family to really alter their belief system in order to accommodate the needs of that individual. So you have then a random system. What does that look like when it's in its disabled form? Chaos, totally, all over the place. The people are. I once, and I have to be careful how I say this. I once saw one of the archetypal hippie families in the world, so that all of us that remember the Chicago 7, well, one of the 7 I saw, and they were the most chaotic. Oh my gosh, they were random. They were amazingly creative. But they were all over the place, and they could never, we'd have a session, and maybe they'd show up, maybe some of them would show up, maybe they'd show up halfway through the session. It was chaos. And so working with a family like this, you're trying to give them more closed system strategies. What's an open system look like in its disabled form? Conversation ad infinitum. They can't make a decision about anything. They talk, they never decide. Okay? So the point being is that David Cantor said that you have many families that are organized in different ways, and there isn't just a single healthy family. Okay? And so you have to sort of tease it apart. However, many models assume that this open, which is sort of more of a middle class, sort of upper middle class, we're going to talk about things, we can all be reasonable, that notion is not sort of the only blueprint for a healthy family, and we really want to hold that true. And also think certainly across different ethnic groups in terms of, families tend to be more closed in this way, more random in some ethnic groups, more open in others, as well as socioeconomic issues as well. Okay? So that's just when we think about structural family therapy, also recognize that there are family types that we want to pay attention to as well. All right, we're going to make a final shift just to the notion of generic family therapy. And with generic family therapy, again, I mentioned that what we're trying to do is we're trying to now think that on this exam, sometimes you're going to come across a question that says a family therapist. If it doesn't relate to a particular model, you're going to have a way to organize yourself and organize your thinking so that you can pull together what are some of the universal notions or qualities that most theories of family therapy have. Okay? So when we think about it, what concepts tend to be more universal running across multiple family models? Homeostasis. Life cycle stages tend to be across many models, right? Joining, entering, the symptoms of metaphor for the problem, okay? There's a whole list that I put together of things that tend to run across most models. Not every model, but most models. So that if you come across a question that just identifies a family therapist, you want to think about, okay, how does engagement occur? The symptom being a metaphor for the problem. How are boundaries dealt with? How's communication dealt with? Again, notion, as you said, homeostasis, feedback loops, circularity, equifinality, should be finality, not equifiality, equifinality or equipotentiality, family life cycle stages, cultural contexts are important, isomorphs, these tend to be all major issues that you want to pay attention to when you think about generic family therapy. Okay?
In the next module, we will now focus on the experiential models of Whitaker, Satir, and Greenberg and Johnson's emotionally focused couples therapy.